California has more people on death row than any other state, with 20 of them being women. In this video, we will discuss all the women in California who are waiting for their execution in the coming years. Cathy Sarinana. In December 2005, in Riverside, California, 13-year-old Conrad Morales and his 11-year-old brother Ricky were living with their aunt, Cathy Sarinana, and her husband, Raul. But instead of providing them with a safe home, the couple turned their house into a place of torment. The boys were beaten, starved, and locked away for days at a time. But it didn't stop there. On Christmas Eve, Conrad was tortured to death and his body was stuffed in a closet while the family continued to celebrate the holiday. And less than a week later, Ricky suffered the same fate. Cathy and Raul wrapped his body in plastic and left it in the garage. They tried to cover their tracks, telling police that Conrad had died from falling in the shower. But the truth came out. The boys had suffered months of abuse, beaten with belts, burned with hot water, and forced to sleep in locked closets without food. In 2009, Cathy was convicted of first-degree murder, torture, and child abuse. She was sentenced to death. Now in her mid-50s, she has spent more than 15 years on death row. Her case remains under appeal and no execution date has been scheduled. Belinda Magaña. In May 2009, in Riverside, California, Belinda Magaña's 2-year-old son, Malachi, suffered severe burns from hot water. And instead of taking him to a hospital, Belinda and her boyfriend, Naresh Narini, left him to suffer. For 5 days, they beat him whenever he cried in pain. And by the time his body finally gave out, the toddler had endured unimaginable agony. But it gets worse. After Malachi died, the couple didn't call 911 and they didn't bury him with dignity. Instead, they went to a party in Apple Valley. When they returned the next day, they dumped his body near a creek, covering their tracks with a missing child report. But investigators quickly saw through the lie. Both were convicted of first-degree murder, torture, and child abuse. And in 2015, Belinda was sentenced to death. Now in her early 40s, she has spent nearly a decade on death row, and no execution date has been scheduled. Manling Williams. On August 7, 2007, in Rowland Heights, California, a young mother made a choice that defied logic. Instead of walking away from her marriage, she slaughtered her entire family. Manling smothered her 2 sons, Devin and Ian, as they slept. She then waited for her husband, Neil Williams, to return home. When he walked through the door, she attacked him with a samurai sword, stabbing him nearly 100 times. Investigators determined that Manling wanted to start a new life with another man and saw her family as an obstacle. On October 4, 2010, Manling was convicted of 3 counts of murder. She was sentenced to death. Now 44 years old, she has spent more than 16 years incarcerated. Her case remains under appeal and no execution date has been scheduled. Maria Rosie Alfaro. On June 15, 1990, in Anaheim, California, 9-year-old Autumn Wallace was home alone when Maria Alfaro knocked on the door. Maria had been a friend of the family and Autumn trusted her enough to let her inside. But that trust cost the child her life. Prosecutors revealed that Maria didn't just kill to stay out of trouble. She kept stabbing long after Autumn was defenseless, up to 50 times. And this great number of wounds suggested rage, not panic. Rosie had planned to steal valuables for drug money, and after the murder, she ransacked the house and sold stolen items for $240. Rosie later confessed, but changed her story multiple times, blaming an unidentified man. On July 7, 1992, Maria was convicted of murder and was sentenced to death. Now in her 50s, she has spent more than 34 years in prison. No execution date has been scheduled yet. Michaud. On December 2, 1997, in Pleasanton, California, 38-year-old Michaud and her partner, James DeVeggio, set out in their green van, searching for prey. They had done it before, scouting young women, luring them in, and subjecting them to hours of unspeakable torture. That day, their target was 22-year-old Vanessa Leigh Sampson, a college student walking alone. Vanessa had no idea the van trailing her was a mobile torture chamber. Michelle and James forced her inside, then spent hours assaulting her before they ended her life with a rope and leaving her body in the Sierra Nevada foothills. When investigators caught up with the pair, they uncovered a chilling history of similar crimes with 5 other young female victims. On April 3, 2002, Michelle Michaud was convicted of murder, kidnapping, and sexual assault. She was sentenced to death. Now 66 years old, she has spent more than 2 decades incarcerated at the Central California Women's Facility. Her case remains under appeal, and no execution date has been scheduled. Skylar Sophia Deleon. On November 15, 2004, in Newport Beach, California, Skylar Julius Deleon posed as a potential buyer for a 55-foot yacht owned by Thomas and Jackie Hawks. The couple had spent years saving for their dream retirement and planned to sell the boat to move closer to family. Skylar, along with 2 accomplices, boarded the yacht under the pretense of taking a test sail. But once they were far from shore, the group attacked. Thomas and Jackie were tied up and forced to sign over ownership of the yacht. Then, with their hands and ankles bound to an anchor, they were thrown overboard, alive. Their bodies were never recovered. Investigators cracked the case after one of Skylar's accomplices confessed, detailing how the victims begged for their lives before being thrown into the ocean. The brutality of the crime, paired with the level of premeditation, left no room for leniency. On April 10, 2009, Skylar was sentenced to death. While incarcerated, she legally transitioned to a woman. Now in her 40s, she has spent more than 15 years on death row. Her case remains under appeal, and no execution date has been scheduled. Maureen McDermott. Before her conviction, Maureen McDermott was a nurse, a woman who once dedicated her life to caring for others. But that image shattered when she was found guilty of hiring a man to kill her roommate on April 28, 1985. The victim, 27-year-old Stephen Eldridge, was found stabbed to death in their shared home, and authorities uncovered a sinister motive. Maureen had taken out a $100,000 life insurance policy on him, hoping to cash in on his death. But the crime wasn't clean. The brutality of the attack, with 44 stab wounds and his genitals mutilated, painted a picture of premeditated murder intended to mislead police into thinking it was a homosexual crime of passion. On December 1, 1990, Maureen was found guilty of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to death, becoming the second woman in California to receive the death penalty in nearly 30 years. Now in her late 70s, she has spent more than 34 years on death row. Her case remains under appeal, and no execution date has been scheduled. Catherine Thompson. Like Maureen, Catherine Thompson orchestrated a murder but left the dirty work to someone else. In 1990, she hired a hitman to kill her husband, Melvin Thompson, a well-respected businessman. Investigators later revealed that her motive was financial gain, insurance money, and control over assets. The hitman shot Melvin at close range and left his body in an abandoned area, trying to make it look like a robbery. But investigators quickly uncovered the truth. The evidence pointed straight to Catherine. In court, she started off calm, but as more details came out, that composure faded. The jury didn't take long to decide. She was guilty. On February 21, 1993, she was sentenced to death. Now in her 60s, Catherine has spent more than 29 years behind bars. Her case remains under appeal, and no execution date has been scheduled. Cherie Rhoades. On February 20, 2014, in Alturas, California, Cherie Rhoades walked into a meeting at the Cedarville Rancheria headquarters, a small northern Paiute tribe in Modoc County. The meeting was held to determine whether she and her family would be evicted from tribal housing due to allegations that she had embezzled federal grant money intended for the tribe. Instead of facing the consequences, Cherie pulled out a semi-automatic handgun and opened fire. She shot and killed 4 people, including the tribal chairman, and wounded 2 others. When she ran out of bullets, she grabbed a butcher knife and attempted to continue the attack before she was overpowered. On September 18, 2017, Cherie was convicted of multiple counts of murder and attempted murder. Witnesses testified that she had shown no remorse for the killings. The jury recommended the death penalty, and the judge upheld their decision. Now in her 60s, she has spent more than 7 years on death row. No execution date has been scheduled. Jessica Marie Hann. On February 21, 2014, in Indio, California, Jessica Marie Hann, born Jason Michael Hann, was sentenced to death for the murder of his 2-month-old daughter, Montana. In 2001, while living in Desert Hot Springs, Jason fatally assaulted Montana, inflicting severe head injuries. Instead of reporting her death, he and his partner, Kerry Lyn Dalton, concealed her body in a plastic container, which they abandoned in an Arkansas storage unit. The gruesome discovery was made when the unit's contents were auctioned off due to unpaid rent. Further investigation revealed that Jason had previously killed his 2-month-old son Jason in Vermont in 1999. The infant's remains were found in a storage unit in Arizona. At the time of their arrest in 2002, Jason and Kerry were living in Portland, Maine, with another infant son who was found to have life-threatening injuries consistent with severe abuse. On December 12, 2013, Jason was convicted of murder and sentenced to death. Kerry was sentenced to 15 years in prison. While on death row, Jason began identifying as a transgender woman and legally changed her name to Jessica Marie Hann. Now in her late 40s, Jessica has spent over a decade on death row. No execution date has been scheduled. Tanya Nelson. On April 21, 2005, in Santa Ana, California, Tanya Nelson walked into the home of psychic fortune teller Haas Smith. But she wasn't looking for a reading, she was there to kill. Tanya had once consulted Haas Smith for guidance on a business venture, and when things didn't go as planned, she blamed the psychic and decided to take revenge. She and an accomplice brutally attacked Haas Smith and her daughter, Anita Vo, stabbing them to death. To cover her tracks, Tanya smeared white paint on the bodies and the walls, hoping to destroy evidence. But detectives quickly linked her to the crime as witnesses, phone records, and financial transactions all pointed to Tanya's role in the murders. On June 30, 2010, she was convicted and sentenced to death. Now in her 60s, she has spent more than 13 years behind bars. No execution date has been scheduled. Lorraine Allison Hunter. On November 3, 2009, in Moreno Valley, California, Lorraine Allison Hunter lured her husband, Albert Thomas, to his parked truck under the pretense of retrieving a sweatshirt. As he knelt in the sleeper compartment, she pulled out a small caliber handgun she'd stolen from a member of her church and shot him twice in the head and then fired 2 more rounds into his back. Lorraine had secretly taken out over $1 million in life insurance policies on Thomas, forging his signature to name herself as the beneficiary. Investigators later learned she had planned his murder 3 times before, but backed out due to witnesses. The case remained unsolved for 2 years until a relative, arrested on an unrelated charge, confessed to what had happened. On December 8, 2017, Lorraine was convicted of first-degree murder with special circumstances for financial gain and lying in wait. The jury recommended death, and the judge agreed. Now 68 years old, she has spent more than 7 years on death row. No execution date has been scheduled. Brooke Rottiers. In August 2006, Brooke Rottiers lured 2 men, Marvin Gabriel and Milton Chavez, to a motel room in Corona, California, under the pretense of sex. Once there, she, along with an accomplice, robbed, beat, and suffocated them. The victims were found with panties and cloth items stuffed in their mouths, and their bodies were bound and taped. They asked for mercy, but instead of mercy, she let them suffocate to death. In October 2010, Brooke was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Now in her 40s, she has spent over a decade on death row. Her case remains under appeal, with no execution date scheduled. Janeen Snyder. In 2001, in Southern California, 16-year-old Michelle Curran vanished without a trace. Unbeknownst to her, she had fallen into the clutches of Janeen Snyder and her partner, Michael Thornton. The couple had a history of luring young girls with promises of safety, only to subject them to unimaginable horrors. Michelle was no exception. She was kidnapped, tortured, and ultimately murdered. Her body was discovered in a barn, naked and beaten, with a single bullet wound to her head. In 2003, Janeen was convicted of first-degree murder, along with charges of torture and sexual assault. She was sentenced to death for her role in the heinous acts. Now in her mid-40s, she has spent over 2 decades on death row. Her case remains under appeal, and no execution date has been scheduled. Cynthia Coffman. In October and November 1986, Cynthia Coffman and her boyfriend James Marlowe started a violent crime spree across California. They kidnapped, robbed, and murdered multiple women, including 20-year-old Corinna Novus and 19-year-old Lynell Murray. The couple lured their victims, subjected them to brutal assaults, and ultimately ended their lives. Their crimes were characterized by a chilling combination of premeditation and cruelty. On November 14, 1986, authorities apprehended Cynthia and James. During the trial, Cynthia's defense claimed she suffered from battered woman syndrome, alleging she was under James's control. However, the prosecution presented compelling evidence of her active involvement, including her presence at the crime scenes and participation in the murders. In 1989, Cynthia Coffman was sentenced to death, becoming the first woman in California to receive such a sentence since the reinstatement of the death penalty in 1977. James Marlowe was also sentenced to death. Now in her early 60s, she has spent over 3 decades on death row. Her case remains under appeal, and no execution date has been scheduled. What do you think of this final verdict? Do you think she was the victim here too? Kerry Lyn Dalton. In June 1988, in Live Oak Springs, California, Kerry Lyn Dalton believed that her roommate, Irene Melanie May, had stolen her jewelry to buy drugs. Angry and high on meth, Kerry and 2 friends, Mark Tompkins and Cheryl Baker, decided to get revenge. They tortured Melanie for hours, hitting her with a cast-iron skillet and injecting her with battery acid. Witnesses later said they heard Melanie screaming, but her body was never found. For years, there were no arrests. But in 1992, new information surfaced, leading police to Kerry. Witnesses claimed she had bragged about the killing. The prosecution had no physical evidence, but her alleged confessions were enough to convict her. In 1995, she was convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. The jury recommended a death sentence, which the judge agreed to. Over the years, Kerry has claimed she is innocent, and many still question whether there was enough evidence to convict her. Now, in her early 60s, she has spent 3 decades on death row. Her case remains under appeal, and no execution date has been scheduled. Susan Eubanks. On October 26, 1997, in San Marcos, California, Susan Eubanks committed an unthinkable act. In a fit of rage and despair, she shot and killed her 4 sons, 14-year-old Brandon, 7-year-old Austin, 6-year-old Brigham, and 4-year-old Matthew. Each child was shot in the head. Afterwards, Susan attempted to take her own life by shooting herself in the stomach, but survived. The motive appeared to stem from personal turmoil and a failing relationship. In 1999, she was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. She has been waiting for her execution date ever since. Veronica Gonzales. In early 1995, 4-year-old Cherie Rhoades was placed under the care of her aunt, Veronica Gonzales, and her husband Ivan in Chula Vista, California. But instead of providing a safe home, the couple subjected Cherie to severe abuse. Neighbors often heard disturbing noises from the Gonzales apartment, including loud bangs and a child's cries. On July 21, 1995, after a particularly loud incident, Veronica sought help, claiming Cherie had been burned in the bathtub. However, upon investigation, authorities discovered that Cherie had suffered extensive injuries over time, including burns, bruises, and signs of prolonged torture. The couple had even attempted to conceal her death by hiding her body in a plastic storage bin filled with cat litter. In 1998, Veronica was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Now in her early 50s, she has spent over 2 decades on death row. No execution date has been scheduled. Socorro Caro. On November 22, 1999, in Santa Rosa Valley, California, Socorro Caro committed a horrifying act. She shot and killed 3 of her 4 sons, 11-year-old Joey, 8-year-old Michael, and 5-year-old Christopher, as they slept in their beds. Her youngest, a 1-year-old, was unharmed. And that was not it. After shooting her children, Socorro turned the gun on herself. She survived, but only after multiple surgeries. When she regained consciousness, she screamed for her mother, wailing in pain. A detective sitting at her bedside heard her mutter something between cries. As the detective listened closely, she claimed Socorro said, "I killed Mike, Chris, and Joey." Investigators believed Socorro did it to get back at her husband during a troubled marriage. In 2002, she was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Now in her late 50s, Socorro has spent over 2 decades on death row. Her case remains under appeal, and no execution date has been scheduled. Valerie Dee Martin. On March 28, 2003, in Lancaster, California, 37-year-old Valerie Martin and her accomplices carried out a brutal crime. Her boyfriend, 61-year-old William Whiteside, had become a problem, and instead of walking away, she made sure he wouldn't stand in her way again. Valerie and her co-defendants beat William severely, locked him in the trunk of his own car, and set the vehicle on fire, burning him alive. The crime was cold and calculated, but the evidence quickly pointed back to her. In the days that followed, detectives pieced together witness statements and physical evidence. Those involved began to turn against her, offering testimony in exchange for leniency. The details of the crime painted a picture of extreme cruelty, and the jury took little time to decide. On March 26, 2010, Valerie was sentenced to death. As of 2025, she has spent over a decade on death row. Her case remains under appeal, and no execution date has been scheduled.